Tonight, it's my great honor to invite and to welcome Dr. Aldrich Chan, who's a neuropsychologist, psychotherapist, and a founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. He's an adjunct professor for the doctoral and master's program at Pepperdine University and is author of the award-winning book, Resembling Models of Reality, published with W. W. Norton's acclaimed interpersonal neurobiology series. Dr. Chan has publications on mindfulness, trauma, creativity, and novel psychotherapeutic approaches. He hosts weekly meditation groups and has been practicing meditation with special interests in Daoism and Zen for over a decade. It was my great good fortune that a few years ago, Dr. Chan reached out to me when he was starting work on his newest book, which was just released last week, which is the topic of this lecture. So congratulations on your book launch in the last week, Dr. Chan.
Thank you so much.
And we started corresponding a little bit about some ideas related to classical Taoism. And although I feel like I just gave sort of a basic bibliography and made a couple comments here, and he did all the hard work. But it was my great joy to be, at least in some way, a part of this project. And I'm so excited to see that this book is now out and to welcome you tonight for this talk. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Chan.
Absolutely. Thank you, Larson, for that generous introduction. And, greetings, everyone. And I want to say that I'm deeply grateful for your presence here today. And I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Brown University's Contemplative Studies program for their gracious invitation. It's a pleasure to gather with minds that are drawn toward the intimate meeting of thought and experience, we could say. And I would also like to acknowledge Larson Di Fiore, who's up there on my screen, as the rest of you are, for not only inviting me, but having the patience and consideration of spending time to consult with me and read through my work and provide excellent feedback throughout. It's really such an honor to have someone with such a refined and cultivated mind to review your work, especially when you know that they have so many other responsibilities. So many thanks to you. Okay. Now, I guess without further ado, I'd like to commence this with just a brief summary of how this book is structured alongside what we will hopefully be able to cover by the end of the hour. That said, it is all in the title. I do begin with a theory on how we have become misaligned with natural principles, principles which were derived from a dialogue between classical Taoism and neuropsychological science. Then the majority of the book is really spent elaborating on these principles, how they appear in classical Taoist texts, the science behind them, and playing a smaller role, how modern hunter-day gatherers in general might harbor a disposition that's aligned with said principles. And it's this disposition that I argue that we should all preserve and carry into our modern-day lives. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we return to live as a hunter-gatherer, but to achieve a more integrated lifestyle. As one of my favorite philosophers would say, Alfred North Whitehead, he would say that the art of progress is to preserve order amid change and preserve change amid order. So let's start off with the first slide here. So there are three phases to the theory of misalignment that I'm proposing. They are separation, alienation, and discord. You could also say SAD for short, SAD. And what I'm going to start off with is the separation phase. So being a neuropsychologist, I am, of course, very interested in the brain. And for me, separation begins with the evolution of neural networks. A neural network refers to several regions in the brain that are working in alliance to serve particular functions. The first network to touch on is the default mode network. My dissertation was on this network, as well as a focus of a lab that I led at University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine, and we were studying the effects of trauma on this network. So it holds a very special significance to me. In fact, the brain photos you're looking at right now come from our study. Nonetheless, the default mode network is related to our ability to retrieve autobiographical memories, to simulate future events, as well as subserving functions like self-reflection and social cognition. The acronym I tend to use for this, I call it the MOTS network for mental time travel, others, and the self. I don't know, that might be helpful for some of you. But the question is, how does that relate to separation? Well, let me throw a question at any of you. I understand that many of you are probably advanced and involved in meditation, but how many of you would say that you found yourself in a reverie or a daydream to the extent that, you lost contact with the present moment? Has that ever happened to anyone here? Just show of hands? Yeah. Yeah. I think we could all agree that's happened, right? Maybe that's what led us to enter into meditation and so forth. But that is a moment where we have decoupled or separated from the immediacy of space and time into our minds, into our abstraction. And so the DMN is one of the networks in the brain related to this capacity of, again, suspending the immediacy of space and time in favor of your internal world. So we have separated from the world in that sense. I'm not going to talk too much about brains, but I definitely want to touch on just a few others because it's important for understanding the rest. So neural networks don't work on their own, but they're rapidly shifting and they're actively conversing, and we could say with other networks. And so for our purposes, I'll highlight two other important networks that are, we could say, the DMN's siblings. First off, we have the central executive network on the left side, and it's not so much about internally directed cognition and mind wandering as it is about planning and analysis and goal-directed action. So we could say that the default mode network, we could say, is a representative of being, and the central executive network a representative of doing. When we plan and analyze, we have the need to inhibit or silence competing signals from the inside and the outside. And as we work out a plan with information that's present in our memory, or what we call working memory, um, that also plays a role in suspending the immediacy of space and time, which also, again, leads to separation. Okay, so these are the two main networks that relate to that. The third network is the salience network on the right side, and that's involved with scanning and evaluating the environment for what is salient or important. It answers the question, what should we be paying attention to? And what shouldn't we be paying attention to? And as a result, it plays it plays as it's a switchboard between the default mode network and the central executive network. Now, this slide highlights all of their relationships. And one of the important things to note here is that the default mode network and the central executive network, as you can see, has an inverse relationship. That means they're mutually inhibitory. They silence one another. When one is on, the other's off. And this actually helps us, by the way, better understand, for example, why a CEO who can be so amazing and so productive can also be so terrible when it comes to their social skills and their social relationships. They've spent way too much time developing, fostering one network over another network. And as a result, it's become imbalanced. And it leads to what I would call a neurodynamic imbalance. Are there any questions up to this point, just about any of the brain stuff? No? Okay. So separation isn't necessarily bad. Just think about an orchestra with several instruments, right? They can play together in harmony, and it brings about creativity and brings about beauty. And for us, human separation likely played a role in, of course, enhancing our capacity to survive because now we could hit that pause button and think in the present moment and analyze and consider what the best action is before acting, right? So instead of running into a bush of poison ivy again, right, we can say, hey, that was a terrible idea last time. Let's not do that, right? And so part of the issue, however, when it comes to these networks, is that on the far end of strategy and planning is objectification and manipulation. And on the far end, we could say, of self-reflection becomes rumination and depression and worry. As the famous Jonas Salk noted, evolution is both a problem-solving and a problem-making process. And while we have been conferred these advantages, we can also get lost in abstractions, resulting in inner discord. And so that's where the alienation component begins to creep in. So while separation was initially, we could say, an advantage, it set the stage for alienation, the potential. Alienation refers to the growth of our symbolic world, particularly through language. Language represents the world, right? The natural world through symbols, meaning it adds another degree of separation from the world around you. And in my previous book, Reassembling Models of Reality, I delved into the various ways we filter and shape our experience of the world. And that method for me was a vertical one, where I was peeling back the layers of experience in an effort to touch upon the most elemental of truths. So you have this perceptual world, but now we also have this conceptual world on the top. And with Daoism, with the help of Larson to help me out with this a little bit, I adopt a path that unfolds horizontally. Rather than framing humankind's condition as a fall, I consider it a straying, right? Whose vulgar Latin root word estragare translates to wandering out of bounds. Language, as Taoism observes, right, deepens this estrangement by carving out distinctions and magnifying the sense of multiplicity and separateness. So it's I think, an interesting perspective to take. So when it comes to the brain, uh, and by the way, I know that this is a little bit science heavy, but I guarantee you the Taoism and classical Taoism is gonna come in. I want to start us off with this. Um, when it comes to the brain, I can't stress enough the importance of the left hemisphere interpreter. Have any of you heard of that before? No? Okay, great. So, you know, in split brain patients, meaning there were patients in the past who've had their corpus callosum split, so that in the center of the brain, there's a band of nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres. And in the past, they would sever these corpus callosum in order to treat medication-resistant epilepsy or intractable epilepsy. And the neuropsychologists Roger Sperry and Gazzaniga and Bogan, they conducted experiments with these subjects and basically helped us realize that there were indeed pretty big differences between the hemispheres. Now, most people have language production and reception or understanding lateralized or specialized towards the left hemisphere. Now, in that context, in one experiment, individuals were shown the word walk, okay, to their left eye, which means their right hemisphere, which can't produce language in the same way the left one does. And then the participant would start to walk. But because there's the disconnection between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, when they were asked why they were walking, they didn't really know why. But what we found out was that their brain made up a response. And one of the participants would respond, well, I'm walking because I'm getting a Coke from the car. Now, the right answer was, of course, they were shown the word walk, and that's why they started to walk. There was another case where I know it's not on the slide, but they were shown the word laugh. And then the person started to laugh, and they're like, well, why are you laughing? And the participant was like, well, because this is a ridiculous job. You guys come up here and test us, every month or so. And they say it, and here's the interesting part is that they say it very, very confidently. Okay, despite the accuracy. And it's a very good reminder that confidence doesn't need to correlate with accuracy. And I share this with you because we all have this left hemisphere interpreter, and its existence was just revealed by these studies. And part of alienation is the overgrowth of these artificial narratives and the left hemisphere's rigid adherence and stubborn egocentric viewpoints that can be sustained in that default mode network that we talked about earlier. And so we all fall prey to many of these narratives, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Zhuangzi would be in great agreement with the fact that these narratives can bring us a lot of trouble, and that the dissipation of narratives through apophatic Taoist meditations may be of great benefit that can assist us in becoming more humble and open and encompassing in our ability to think. Okay. So we now pivot to the relevance of history in alienation and mismatch theory. This is a very important point. And actually, I think mismatch theory is also a place where there's some convergence between science and classical Taoism. So mismatch theory is the idea that that modern conditions are incompatible with the conditions we originally evolved for. Okay. It's a very simple idea, but very, very powerful. So up to 99% of our species history has been spent as hunter-gatherers. Okay. And consider the differences of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle and the lifestyles that we're living today. Such a drastic change can lead to adaptive lags between certain traits that we acquired and what these traits were intended for, and the conditions that are actually presented to us. And so the time period of interest, the first one that led to this transition to me is the agricultural revolution dating back to circa 10,000 BCE. Hunter-gatherers were transitioning from this nomadic lifestyle to one that was sedentary. And just like we were unaware of how technology may be impacting us today, we thought that it was just a good idea, right? Before this, we had typical pressures, right? Resources, mates, environmental conditions, predators. But after this, societies began to expand, right, based on the stability that was afforded through farming and deforestation and new tools and other methods. And it's really only estimated that 10 million hunter-gatherers are all that could be sustained given their lifestyle, compared to the emergence of 100 to 200 million people by about 500 BCE. And well, today we have 8.2 billion people in this world, right? And greater population leads to spread of diseases, government regulation, competition for resources, and social standing. And with all that comes stress. And not just episodic stress, as most hunter-gatherers would experience most of the time, but more chronic stress. And the amplification of stress we know has really bad consequences to our brain, right? It could impact our brain structure, our plasticity, neurogenesis, memory, cardiovascular health, metabolism, and increases in anxiety, depression, and so forth. Our modern society is known to evolutionary psychologists as a weird society. The acronym WEIRD stands for Westernized, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And it shows just how different things are today when compared to the past. So what were some of these hunter-gatherer societies like? And there are many myths to them, actually, because there are modern hunter-gatherer societies, and some of them are relatively well studied. The first thing to note is that leisure time is not sacrificed in hunter-gatherer communities, with, in fact, the opposite being true. And this is very strange considering, right, the purpose of technology was to provide us with more leisure time so that we could actually think about more meaningful and complex things. The second thing that ended up happening were that diets are of a healthier balance because agriculture ended up restricting diets because of many previous foragers due to select crops that would grow in their regions, which could lead to malnutrition. The third part were the fact that the sedentary settlements brought higher levels of infections and disease due to crowding. And then finally, in industrialized societies, well, we have higher levels of socioeconomic differences and inequality, right, among sexes. Hunter-gatherer communities tend to have higher rates actually of well-being and a lower incidence rate of psychological conditions when compared to industrialized civilizations. And there are many theories to this. One of the leading ones comes from Chaudhry and Salali, who highlight equality, present orientation, social support, explorative learning, alloparenting, and equality as being extremely important. So just to touch on these briefly, well, present orientation is self-explanatory, right? This is translated, however, into actions. So lots of hunter-gatherer societies don't actually have reserves of food, and they, lived day to day, something we call immediate return. Um, and when it comes to social support, well, they are surrounded by family and friends all the time and in close proximity. We are separated by walls and distance and even, social etiquette. Explorative learning is important, having children literally explore on their own. Hunter-gatherer children often learn a lot from older kids, and they sometimes are not even even monitored. Alloparenting plays an important role and involves parenting from many others. The average, for example, hunter-gatherer child spends about 40% of their time with their biological parents, and then they are parented by several others for the other 60% of the time. Um, and what is the benefit of this? Well, think about the fact that lots of parents, unfortunately, are not suited to be good parents. And if you have many other parents, it could potentially deter attachment problems, right? Make children feel equally loved and maximize their potential to thrive. They're also exposed to more bacterial colonies, which can improve their immune system. And so there are many levels of analysis to this of why that can be beneficial. Um, the whole, idea of sleep training and Modern day parenting, where the two parents have to take care of a bunch of children on their own without any help, just leads to burnout. And for many of you who may be parents, it's, as you know, it's challenging, and it can be quite taxing. Um, Equality is another part. Egalitarian principles, these are all very much respected by hunter-gatherers. Each person was equally entitled to food, regardless of their ability to find or capture them. Everything was shared. There's no one that had really more wealth than another. And I would also add movement is an important thing here because, for example, on average, Westerners, if you average um, uh, males and females, it's around 4,500 steps a day. The Hadza, it's if you average between 18 to 75 years old, it's about 14,500 steps a day. And a great example of really integrating the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is finding the in-between, right? And actually what we find in science now is that we benefit from 7 to 12,000 steps a day. That really optimizes our health benefits. Finally, um, the ego inflation kept in check. There were some fun stories about this, but ultimately it's the fact that some tribes, like one called the Bayaka, there are social rules that prevent one from getting their ego out of balance. As an example, if someone comes back from a hunt and they're successful, but they have this inflated ego and they're puffing their chest and so forth, they're actually shamed and made fun of by others in the community. And in contrast, if someone comes back from, let's say, a successful hunt and they are self-deprecating, like, maybe they come back with one animal and they say, well, I should have brought back two because I saw so many others. That sort of behavior tends to be encouraged. And as many of you know, if we look, for example, at Western style paintings and Chinese style paintings, you'll find that the individual or the self tends to be far more minimized in Chinese paintings versus those in Western that really focuses on the individual. Okay, so now we're going to start bringing a little more of classical Taoism, and this one comes from the Huainanzi, and so I'm going to read this out and just say a few things about this that I think are interesting. So things reached the stage when people built great mansions, houses, and palaces, yet even this did not suffice to fill the desires of the rulers of men. Thus the pine, the cypress, and the flowering bamboo drooped and rotted in the summertime. The Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the three streams became exhausted and ceased flowing. Marauding wild animals became even fiercer. The common people had only small reed huts for houses, with nowhere for travelers to find lodging. Those who died of cold and hunger lay as close together as pillows to mats. Thus it came to pass that they divided mountains and streams to make territories and boundaries. They counted the population to divide the masses of people by numbers. They created insignia for those who managed affairs, made regulations of clothing and rank, differentiated between noble and base. Weapons and armor flourished, and contention and conflicts broke out. That the common people suffered extermination, repression, and disasters was all due to this. So I thought this was a very powerful passage. Um, and it's such a powerful passage because it echoes the theme of misalignment, right? In particular, it parallels the idea of, for example, hunter-gatherers operating with a sufficiency mindset, right? They were, again, immediate return hunters and foragers. They just got what they needed and then they moved on, right? Now, what happened, however, is that for humans, right, desires grew so much to the point that instead of a sufficiency mindset, it actually paradoxically went backwards into a scarcity mindset, even though now the issues are actually excess. And so to meet these selfish desires, humans ended up exploiting the land, creating instability. Then came these abstract categories and divisions and symbols, leading to more fragmentation and strife. And from the Zhuangzi, Um, I've heard that in the most ancient of times, birds and beasts were numerous, while human beings were few. So the people all built nests in trees to avoid them. During the day, they gathered acorns and chestnuts. At night, they climbed back up to the top of the trees. For this reason, they're called the people of the nesting clan. Following this in high antiquity, people knew nothing about clothes and garments. In the summertime, they would collect great piles of firewood, which they would then burn in the winter to keep warm. For this reason, they're called the people who knew how to live. In the age of the divine farmer, the people slept in peace at night and got up to proceed with calm. They knew their mothers but not their fathers, and they lived side by side with the elk and deer. They tilled the soil to eat, wove fabrics to dress themselves, and in their hearts and minds were utterly free from ideas of doing each other harm. This is the epitome of perfect potency. So this is Olivia Cohn's translation. Um, from chapter 29. And just a few notes. If we look at these three paragraphs as three different phases, right? The first phase, and I think of it this way because I'm a neuropsychologist, but the first phase, right, we have basic cognitive abilities and motor skills that enable us to plan in the short term and improve our survival. Now, in phase two, we now have the ability to harness fire and plan in the long term, becoming aware of the seasons, right? So this is the separation phase. This is the default mode network and the central executive network evolving and developing, right? Yet all is still in harmony. In phase three, people no longer are living in constant fear of the unpredictable, given their ability for prospection or simulating the future, so that they can now sleep at peace or in peace, and they can also or they've also improved upon their fine motor skills and planning to dress and learn basic farming. And again, this is what I mean by separation doesn't necessarily equal discord or problems, right? Now, this line's kind of interesting. They knew their mothers, but not their fathers. It's my understanding that patrilineal systems were more common during the Neolithic period. Someone maybe can correct me on this, but my guess is that the phrase intentionally flips the expectation to highlight a time when society was egalitarian and when these rigid gender roles had not yet emerged. And so people lived naturally, they lived closer to the land and closer to one another. And so I would guess that for Zhuangzi, this imagined golden age would be likely at that sort of transitional period between that hunter-gatherer and the agricultural revolution. Okay. Are there any questions up to this point? Should I maybe just save questions for the end? Okay. All right. Um, okay, so the Discord phase. Discord now incorporates all the previous levels. Historically, we might say that the Industrial Revolution cemented the idea that humankind is superior to nature and that nature is here to serve our needs. Discord really occurs when separation becomes wrought with alienating artificial narratives and opposition. So to me, dualism is, and as an example, is a big issue. I mean, we're born into this world with a body, a direct connection to nature, yet many of us were indoctrinated into the prevailing notion that the mind or the soul and the body are separate, with the mind being greater than the body in some way. And from this perspective, the value of our body depreciates because we start thinking of our body as a ball and chain in contrast to who we actually are. The body becomes a scapegoat, right, for everything society deems distasteful. So someone has inappropriate outbursts of aggression, someone has excessive lust or gluttony, right? And what they end up doing is blaming it on their body. They're blaming it on their biology. All that is base is related to the body, while everything that's pure and sacred and of value is in the soul or the mind. And if we think of it this way, that's a direct fragmentation of ourselves, and it's a recipe of a human being in perpetual conflict with itself, right? Um, the other parts of the Discord, involve social media and technology. Of course, we know social media can exploit our attentional resources, leading to greater susceptibility to consuming false information, especially this day, and polarizing information. And AI is getting so advanced that it's hard to tell the difference, right? It's very concerning. At a biological level, we have natural reinforcement systems that have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, but they're now being targeted and repurposed for reinforcing ideologies and for us to be sold products, right? And so there's also a wide-ranging opportunity of instant gratification, which is then going to change the way that our brains are organizing information. So people now develop a preference for feeling excited, right, about meaningless content as opposed to, meaningful content. And the virtual world starts to grow in significance. And what happens in reaction, the value of nature becomes quietly depreciated or relegated. And humanity starts losing touch with the natural world that they evolved in. So their understanding and their perception of its value, followed by their motivations to protect it, are also going to go down. And so without awareness of consequences or our experience of connection to the natural world, humans can become myopic and we end up abusing the world for gain, right? And so we are caught up in what I call nets in the book, which are narratives, emotions, thoughts, and sensations. Hmm. was going to say one of the other kind of interesting things that came up as I was looking at some of the literature, one of the ideas that of the reasons of why it's so hard for us to be kind to nature or for humans to think in the long run about nature is because for that 99% of our human history, we never had to worry about that sort of thing. We never had to think that far, right? And so it's hard for us. We get blinded by temporal distance. So it's kind of interesting to note that. Okay. All right, so we're out of the neck of the woods in relationship to the sad theory, and we're now moving into well, we could first say the shared arena um, where classical Taoism and I think science can have a conversation. And the place where they meet is in complex systems theory and fractals. So one of the papers that I really enjoyed reading comes from Brown's very own Harold Roth on the concept of Li. In its earliest definition, Li refers to the signature vein patterns on jade, and that shapes how the mineral fragments when cut. And this evolved into patterns of nature flowing through the individual and the universe. But where do we even begin to understand these patterns, right? And to me, the answer is fractals, which is closely linked to complex systems theory, a theory that I found very resonant again with Taoist thinking and scientific frameworks of the mind. So let's begin with fractals. One of the properties of fractals is something called self-similarity, where patterns of the whole are reflected in the parts. So physically, we find this in ferns and Romanesco broccoli and snowflakes. Something cool about fractals, by the way, just viewing fractals can actually reduce stress up to 60%. It can relax you. It increases alpha waves in the frontal lobes, which are wakeful yet relaxed, and it can even improve mental performance. And so this response is thought to come from, again, an evolutionary adaptation of the visual system to efficiently process natural fractals that creates this resonance within us that can soothe cognitive stress. And fractals are everywhere. Ridges of mountains, as an example, that's a form of fractal geometry, not Euclidean. And there's also, they can be linear, they can be nonlinear, complex, symmetrical, asymmetrical. My view is that psychologically, the seven principles can be understood as a form of self-similarity or fractal self-similarity. Now, complex systems theory is borrowed from mathematics, and it studies systems composed of many interacting components whose collective behavior can then produce an emergent property that can't be understood by looking at individual components alone. So it's that sort of idea of the gestalt, right? The sum is, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When we think about the mind and brain, we might consider it from multiple levels here. Okay, so we have genes, we have cells, we have regions, we have networks, we have electromagnetic activity, and then we have everything in relationship to the environment and each other, right? In other words, they exhibit heterogeneity, leading to a variety of interactions. These interactions can create emergent patterns, and these emergent patterns incorporate feedback loops and feed-forward loops from the hierarchy back down to the roots. So, like if we think about from the brain, those electromagnetic waves can actually create effects that go downstream, right, all the way down those different levels, and so on and so forth. And so that would be then leading to spontaneous self-organization, right? Another connected term to this that's important is recursion, which is when a system can change that from which it emerged. So the mind, we could say, can change the brain, just as the brain can also alter aspects of our mind. A complex system is open, meaning the boundaries are solid but porous, resulting in an exchange of information and energy between the world and ourselves. It's adaptive, right? If we think of the brain as an adaptive organ, it changes in response to the external world, and change is not restricted to the present moment. And then there's uncertainty involved because well, again, because they can be linear or nonlinear, responses could have a disproportionate output to input ratio, and there's always this degree of chance. And well, chance leads to randomly distributed probability distributions that can occur naturally within components of a complex system, which leads to predictions to be uncertain. Okay, so now that we've covered some of the sad theory and shared a medium where Tao and science can meet, we're going to visit part of the solution. The idea is quite simple, right? There are seven principles in nature that are found at all levels of existence. I would consider these as part of Tao's ebb and flow. Note that the emergent acronym, and I like my acronyms, I learned it from my mentor, Dan Siegel, CPR West. And so to me, that was quite suitable because that's what the goal of the book really is. And to begin, we could say that each one of these principles can be understood as an invitation to a particular way of engaging the world and ourselves. To live with the Tao is to live with these principles, and to live with these principles, one recovers potency. What is potency? Let's look to some of the passages here. Um, from the Huainanzi originating the way. If you are able to preserve it here, then your potency will not diminish. The myriad things commingle in profusion, and you can revolve and transform together with them, and thereby listen to the entire world. It is like galloping with the wind at your back. This is called perfect potency. If you attain perfect potency, then you will be truly content. Something that this reminds me of actually is a time I grew up in Costa Rica as a fun fact. And there was a time I was kayaking with a friend of mine and we were hit by a storm and it was pouring rain and there was fog that was developing and we couldn't see the beach anymore. And so we decided that we needed to start paddling in a particular direction. And we were competitive youngsters at the time. So we were like, I was like, oh, we have to go this way. He was like, we have to go that way. And we finally figured out which way we were supposed to go. And so we were paddling against the current at the end and we weren't getting anywhere. And then eventually we just sat there and realized we just need to let go and just trust nature and wait for the fog to lift. And within 10 to 15 minutes, the fog lifted, and we saw that we were pretty much exactly in the same spot that we were in the very beginning. And the beach was actually in the direction of the current. And so when we paddled back, it was nearly effortless. And we arrived back to the beach much faster than expected and even rode a wave back in. And so it's just reminds me of this, it's like galloping with the wind at your back, right? It's just this, there's a dynamism to the way which speaks to nature as a process, and aligning with nature provides support second to none. Another passage here, thus, when the ruler has perfected potency, his words are identical with his plans, his actions are identical with his intentions, above and below are one mind. To me, this quote echoes the principles of wholeness and equilibrium, which also bridges a core psychotherapeutic goal, which is integration and coherence. We like to say one of the goals of therapy broadly would be to be more flexible, adaptive, coherent, energetic, and Um, Huainanzi, the basic warp. Therefore, the rule of the perfected person is like this. His mind is coextensive with his spirit. His physical form is in tune with his nature. When he is still, he embodies potency. When he acts, he patterns himself on penetration. He follows his spontaneous nature and aligns himself with inevitable transformations. And again, this last one is packed with examples that's related to the seven principles, right? The passage alone contains principles of relationship, of spontaneity, of transformation, and of creativity. So let's start with creativity. Creativity as a principle. Firstly, where do we find creativity in the Taoist classics? Everywhere, right? You could pick lots of lines and it shows up everywhere, right? So here we have, uh, it's been a pain for me because I think Larson, I told you that I speak Cantonese and not Mandarin, and so I've been having to, change things back and forth. But for the first lines in the Tao Te Ching, right? It's Do Ho Do, Fei Seng Do, Ming Ho Ming, Fei Seng Ming. Mo Ming Tin Day, Zi Qi, Yao Ming Man Mat Zi Mo. So the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. The name is the mother of all things. So the Tao that can be told, right? We find it in the very first lines, the idea that there is this nameless creative mystery at the root of existence, right? Unfolding through this dynamic tension between the unnamed and the named, and it's birthing all these forms. More specifically, the action of naming, crystallizing potential into patterns and forms, right? And then this other one by Zhuangzi, wonderful the process which fashions and transforms us. What is going to turn you in? What is it going to turn you into? In what direction will it use you to go? Will it make you into a rat's liver or a fly's leg? So this one was a translation from A.C. Graham. Um, but in his typical playful manner, right? It's an attitude of embracing the changes that comes, the changes that creativity brings us. And I would say it's also really worth noting that it's not just the content, right? But the process underlying the content of all of these Taoist work that speaks to unconventional approaches to common ideas, right? The use of the uselessness, the primacy of nothingness, uh, the importance of paradox, or the chosen exemplars of the way, right? Or Zhuangzi's extravagant parables, and the list goes on. All right, so how do I define creativity? How does this relate to the science portion? So creativity is the fact that the way I see it, it's the fact that first of all, our universe is always in a process of creation and that it is continually created and continues to create a diversity of non-living and living systems, right? So kind of two aspects to this. First of all, that we're always on the edge of creation, and what's right in front of us is nothingness, and then it's created, and there's nothingness, and it's created, and we're always stepping into that. To me, it's just always mind-blowing to think about that, right? But creativity, I can think of from three perspectives: from being, doing, and attending. And I use this actually in relationship to all the different principles, and these three relate to those three different networks I talked about. The being and becoming portion, again, the representative being the default mode network, the attending, the salience network, the doing, the central executive network. Okay, so a creative being is someone who is adaptive, someone who's flexible and open to nature's creative impulse, right? They can relate to themselves in the world through many lenses. Following suit, creative attending refers to the ability to attend to the moment flexibly, and that can birth new pathways of being and doing in the world. And then creative doing is what most people think of when they think of creativity, and that's sort of the act of generating unique, complex, and/or novel ideas, forms, or other expression that can be adapted in a meaningful context. Something that I think is kind of interesting, this question, can you find solace in creativity, right? Because every moment is an act of creation and each moment is unique. And here's something kind of fun to experiment with the next time that you feel agitated, right? Next time you feel uneasy, try to step outside yourself and observe the experience and first consider that you are unique and that there's no one else in history that's exactly like you. Second, that the conditions of life are also completely unique and completely different from a few seconds ago, even, and will continue to change as time moves on. And if we put these all together, is it possible that you may have birthed a completely new experiential tone into this world? Regardless of how you identify the attached emotion, you may say this is melancholy or this is sadness or whatever, but could that specific experience be actually something new that's been created into this universe? And can that actually perhaps relieve some of the uh, agitation that you might feel in the moment? I think that it's a powerful way to think about it and meditate on, or contemplate rather. All right, so if we're to resonate with this generative principle of creativity, we have to learn how to adapt and accept changes. Change is creativity in action. It's the way that I kind of view it. So how do we develop an embracing attitude? Well, first let's examine what happens when we don't. On the one end, we stagnate, right? We're unable to let go of a substance, of a relationship, or even an idea. And in these moments, our world is going to narrow into a fixation, and we miss out on all the other opportunities that are there. Like in addictions, the substance itself becomes all that's pleasurable. There's nothing else that's pleasurable in people who have addictions. And so an addiction, it can cast a giant shadow over all the other pleasures in your life. And you end up actually robbing yourself of a greater diversity of pleasures by doing so. So we stagnate, we remain stuck in a place of comfort without growth, and we're continually ruminating about what could be, possibly fearful about what could be, and what could be might just be a fantasy. And as a result, we become agitated or ill, according to the Naya. Worry and grief generate illness. When illness reaches a distressing degree, you die. When you think about something and don't let go of it, internally you will be distressed. Externally, you will be weak. On the other end, there's chaos. We might imagine someone who is, let's say, who has bipolar condition and they're manic. There's a flight of ideas. There's excessive talking, right? And they're not really talking with anyone. They're just kind of talking at you, right? High levels of impulsivity, risk-taking, maybe they're stimulus bound, similar to people who have ADHD, right? They have to touch everything, they have to see everything. Or less severe, people who are addicted to dopamine rushes, right? And overstimulated by society, so they're enamored with their senses. And while the person may feel like they're on top of the world, there's usually a risk of crashing and burning. Hence this current obsession with like the dopamine detox, right? And so creativity has elastic bounds that provides context, whereas chaos is senseless. And so we can sort of go back to the Naya and even the Tao Te Ching to find support for some of these ideas, right? The reason for its losses in reference to vitality is inevitably pleasure and anger, worry and anxiety. When you are inwardly tranquil and outwardly reverent, you are able to return to your innate nature. Or the quite famous in chapter 12, right? The five colors cause one's eyes to be blind, the five tones cause one's ears to be deaf, the five flavors cause one's palate to be spoiled, racing and hunting cause one's minds to be mad, right? All right. So the intolerance of uncertainty is one of the major challenges that we face as humans. Very commonly, it leads to anxiety. How do we face it? In science, one of the ways we address this is helping individuals reframe how uncertainty can be considered as both a threat and an opportunity, right? Obviously, the anxiety comes from viewing it as a threat, and a story that you're all probably well aware of, right, that I found in the Huainanzi can play a great role in bolstering this message, right? And this is the story of the skilled diviners and the beautiful horse, right? Oh, you're all familiar with this, right? Or yeah, yeah, I'm sure this was a biased crowd, but well, let me just um, uh, just go through it really quickly, right? Just in case anyone hasn't heard of it or anyone watching this in the future might not have heard of it. So and I'm just paraphrasing, but so it begins with a family, right, of skilled diviners, and let's say the father is a very skilled diviner, and they have a farm, and in this farm they have horses, and their most beautiful horse runs away, right, and this beautiful horse runs away, and then the villagers come by expressing their sympathies, but the father diviner looks at them, and his response, right, is, well, this will be fortunate, or this will be good fortune, right, bring good fortune, right? And then the villagers leave confused. And then a month later, the horse arrives with more horses, right? The villagers come by and they're all excited. They're like, wow, this is amazing. This is great, right? But then the father says, no, this will be a disaster. The villagers left and they're confused. They're like, that's the very strange response, right? And what happens a few weeks later, the son is training one of these wild horses and gets thrown off and breaks his leg, right? And then the villagers come by, express their sympathies. Of course, the father diviner says, this will bring great fortune. This will bring great fortune, right? And then all of a sudden, a few weeks or months later, the army comes by and they try and draft the son, but the son has a broken leg, and as a result, they do not draft the son, and they find out that the son would have been participating in a battle where 9 out of 10 people died, right? And so the villagers come by and they're extremely excited and happy, and the father, right, looks at them and he's like, oh, this will be a disaster, right? So a threat and opportunity, opportunity and threat. This parable actually I use a fair amount in my practice, and it's always a hit. So it's a great way to approach it. What else can be done? Well, we can help others redefine how they understand change, right? So another perspective is that change can be viewed as a precondition for balance, right? So when we're hungry, we're off balance, so we eat. When we're thirsty, we drink. It's in service of homeostasis, a biological term for a balanced physiological system. And when faced with uncertainty, what type of change is beckoning us, and what corresponding dimension of life requires balance? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Uncertainty can also be adopted as an intentional stance. It's when we are uncertain that we are open to the greatest range of possibility. It's when we're uncertain that we become alert, when we become present. It's because of uncertainty that we have adventure, right? It's certainty, actually, that's the death of a question. It's static, it's narrow, it's rigid. And perhaps the unanswerable questions, or those questions with evolving responses, are the ones that are worthy of continuous answering and questioning and responding, right? Humans continually try to cling to static identities and selves when the truth is that we are events in creation. So this strategy doesn't make sense. We all have potentials seeking to express themselves, and it's really in our own silliness and illusory beliefs that lead us to fear what we will evolve into next, right? And so from the Zhuangzi, in the mountain tree, without praises, without curses, now a dragon, now a snake, you transform together with the times and never consent to be one thing alone. In the book, I joke that oftentimes other people will say that people cling to unhealthy habits and that people will say that these people are greedy, right? They want all the money, they want all the sweets, they want all the pleasure. But perhaps Zhuangzi might laugh at this and argue that they're not greedy enough. Why limit the self to a single identity, right? When they can embrace the boundless potential of becoming everything, right? So, okay. Um, When the brain confronts uncertainty, there are three important areas to think about. The amygdala, which is the seat of our primal alarm system, it greets the unknown as if it were a danger. It increases our stress levels and vigilance. Meanwhile, the other region is the prefrontal cortex, which begins to work with deliberation, and it weighs and it forecasts and basically can contrive a course of action. Yet these systems are not isolated, right? They're conversing with each other. And it's conversing with each other through connections that are relayed through a third area called the thalamus. And the thalamus is that which mediates between our alarms and our reasoning, and it permits a voice to each one of those areas. So, what's the optimal thing to do? We want to find a balanced response, right? One that doesn't negate one or the other, but can harmonize the two. We want a whole response, not a fragmented one. So, what are some fragmented ones? Well, catastrophic thinking, right? Allowing our centers of analysis or frontal regions to be recruited by these overactive regions like the amygdala. And another one would be over rationalization, right? Ignoring the amygdala's alarm by focusing on only what's positive. That's also not accurate. When we're confronted with uncertainty, we become imbalanced. And just like in Taoism, it's best for us to be balanced when we make a decision. When we realize change is necessary, but we aren't sure what actions need to take place, we can remember that change is a precondition for balance, right? So we need to balance ourselves. And the first way is to be present with our emotions. And the simple way of doing this is literally labeling whatever emotion you might be experiencing. When you label an emotion, it's found in the neurosciences that the simple action actually reduces the limbic activity, what Siegel used to call a name it to tame it. We also adopt this process-oriented mindset, and part of this means that we become discovery-driven, right, versus solution-driven. In discovery, there are no expectations, right? No expectations. And what does the Tao Te Ching suggest? No expectations. This means there is no expected threat. It's just information, right? Just information and energy. So that what happens is that the amygdala's response ends up becoming reduced or silenced. And instead of the frontal lobe engaged with threat detection or threat analysis, we are in exploratory mode. We view the whole receptively, and we play with the information as they come, curiously noting this and that, right? Without necessarily judging or categorizing things, right? The second part is recognizing that uncertainty is the only certainty. And again, its benefits for like if we take on this um, um, intentional stance, what I think Cohn might call a stance of unknowing, which I like that one. Um, so we ebb and flow with events as they unfold. And just like the diviner, the opportune can become a threat, and the threat can become an opportunity. And then thirdly, it's embodying this affirmative yes when it comes to conditions out of our control because, well, there's nothing else we can do, right? So, all right. I know we're already at 63 minutes. Um, do I have more time to move forward? I actually have a fair amount
Sure.
more. Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, so you could just let me know when you want me to stop. Um, so we're going to talk a bit about meditation. The birthplace of being is non-being. Non-being is the fount of creativity. How do we empty our minds so that the way can be received? Well, this can be achieved in many different ways, and one of the ways is, of course, meditation. And there is currently so much information on meditation that it's hard not to be inundated by them. Unfortunately, there are but a few meditations specifically related to Taoist meditations, and they tend to have very small sample sizes. And so there's nothing really that's like we can really generalize yet. And so there's definitely room for work here. Nonetheless, we can consider Taoist meditations perhaps a mix of both open monitoring and focused attention meditation, probably a little more open monitoring than the other. But generalizations that can be made in these types of meditations is that they provide cognitive benefits, immunity improvements, emotion regulation, improved well-being, and it can change brain connectivity and structure and function. Okay. And one could argue that these are also a part of the potency that's recovered when we spend time in nature, right? And by that, I don't mean just spending time in natural environments, which also has benefits, but the nature of your mind, right? Equanimity is the natural state of our mind. When unperturbed by nets from the narratives, emotions, thoughts, and sensations, our minds naturally return to stillness. Yet stillness is, of course, not stasis. When we look at meditation studies, a few fascinating things happen. And the approach I'm taking is to look at them again through distributed neural networks, the ones that I already talked to you about earlier on. So there is overall a silencing of the default mode network, which I relate to our narrative self processes. So specific reduction, specifically in an area called the posterior cingulate cortex, the PCC over here, okay, and the medial prefrontal cortex. These two areas are two nodes of the default mode network, very important regions that allow us to engage in, the mental time travel, others, and the self, and cognitive processes related to that. But there is so first of all, what this relates to very much is reduced self-referential processing, or let's put it simply, reduction of a sense of self, right? And there's also connectivity within the default mode network overall, which is believed to allow us to enhance our attentional shifting. So we're not just focused on our internal narratives. Okay, so one other replicated result is that the posterior cingulate cortex has increased connectivity to the rostral lateral prefrontal cortex during resting state, which is actually part of the central executive network. And what's interesting about this is that it relates to our ability to shift from mind wandering to focused attention. And this happens, it's found more so during a resting state. Okay, so I was going to go through this other principle process and talk about like intuition and stuff. Um, I'm just gonna go on until Larson tells me to shut up. All right, so let's read some of these passages. Right, this is what it's called: the transformation of things. In the great beginning, there was non-being, there was no being, no name. Out of it arose one. There was one, but it had no form. Things got hold of it, and it came to life, and it was called virtue. Before things had forms, they had their allotments. These were of many kinds, but not cut off from one another. They were called fates. Out of the flow and flux, things were born, and as they grew, they developed distinctive shapes. These were called forms. In the DDJ, man models himself after earth, earth models itself after heaven, heaven models itself after Tao, and Tao models itself after nature. Tao produced the one produced the two produced the three, and the three produced the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things carry the yin and embrace the yang, and through the blending of the material force, they achieve harmony. And in the Nea, the way is what infuses the body, yet people are unable to fix it in place. It goes forth, but it does not return. It comes back, but it does not stay. Surging forth, it arises with us. And so I just loved reading that because reading those passages brings home this next principle, process. Process means that nature is alive, it's dynamic, it's progressing moment to moment, it's developing, it's coming, it's going, it's evolving through these endless successions of interrelated events, right? So it emphasizes our reality as a verb and not a noun, right? It's like a never-ending jazz improvisation. There's this preserved order, but also spontaneity. So existence is not static and it's mechanistic. It's again a progression of events, endlessly gushing forth. And with this in mind, we want to gush forth with this process, right? How do we do that? When it comes to being, process is about receptivity. Can we receive the flow without bias? When it comes to the processual attending, it's simply about being present and thus contextually adaptive. We might think of Harold Roth's idea of cognitive attunement here, right? With processual doing, the principle is about being process-oriented, meaning being explorative over analytical, discovery-driven over solution, attuned to movement over stasis, to experience over abstraction, right? The things that we kind of mentioned a little bit, which had some crosstalk with the creativity section. When we're not attuned, we become either too close to the process or too far away. To be too close can be characterized as like an impulsive individual who thinks like, I'm just going to act out my impulses then. That's what Taoism's all about, right? I'm just going to act them all out, right? But that's obviously not the case, right? They're at the edge of their narratives, emotions, and thoughts and sensations. They say they're going with the flow, but they're really just going with their egoic natures. And to be too detached from the process is also a problem. It's to be hyperopic. And this is to become too enamored now with the abstractions and the conceptual world. One of the major problems with intellectuals. To be resonant with the process is to be aligned, integrated, and spontaneous, which is not impulsive as it is to be respectful of the context, right? Maybe an aha moment while playing a game of pool over someone just blurting out this, a random idea that has nothing to do with anything. So we've talked about meditation as a way of getting closer to this creative source. What are we left with when we are appropriately attuned in our waking lives? Are we just these empty bags of flesh that are running into objects in the world? No, right? We still obtain a form of simplicity yet complexity. You might not like the word complexity, but I make an argument for that. Um, but what we do is we allow our intuition to guide us. And intuition to me is like the old growth forest of our minds. And there are 2 points to intuition that I would like to tackle before ending. The first idea is that by aligning with nature, virtue, without the title of virtue, right, would reign. To be with the Tao is to be congruent, no need for the abstract considerations of morality. As these ideas have entered, we've already lost the Tao, right? Second, Zhuangzi distrusted conceptual ideas and language, right? But he did argue that there is a higher truth. And this truth, I would characterize as intuition, right? He didn't believe that little understanding from the intellect could ever reach a whole truth. Rather, from great understanding comes from this sort of pure embodied intuitive response. And so now my question is, well, is there any truth to any of this, right? And I'm going to argue that there is. So let's begin with this idea of moral intuitionism. Is there any evidence that supports that morality may not be societal constructions, rather inborn, innate? Given our time, I'm just going to share 3 seminal studies that support this argument, and I mentioned more in the book if you're interested. But let's begin with rats, right? We want to begin with rats. So in 2011, Bartol, DCD, and Mason, they conducted a study where they would, this is a great, great study, by the way. So they would place a rat in a trap, right? And they would then release another rat into the same environment. Now there's a big open space here. Now the trapped rat is trying to get out and it's squealing and help, 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 help in rat language, right? And then the free rat has to run through open space to save this trapped rat. But keep in mind that running into open space is very dangerous for rats. And again, they're also hearing the cries from the trapped rat, and so there's a high amount of risk involved. Nonetheless, by the end of the study, the majority of the rats will free their cage mates. And this, by the way, ranks even higher if they themselves have been in this position as a trapped rat. In another condition, they added chocolate chips contained in a second restrainer. They wanted to see if this would outcompete for their desire to save the cage mate. And what did they find? Well, the majority of rats actually saved their cage mate first, and then they would go together and share the chocolate chips. Okay, so it's a really beautiful study. And there are many others, by the way. Now let's move on to monkeys. This is an older study, one of those studies that probably would never pass today. Um, so in 1964, researchers Masserman, Wetchkin, and Terrace, they conducted an intriguing study with 15 feral rhesus monkeys. These monkeys were trained to pull a chain to receive food when they saw a blue light or a red light for 5 seconds. And in the experimental setup, one monkey was pulling a chain while being able to see another monkey in an adjacent compartment who was also pulling chains for food. Now, once they figured all this out, on the 4th day of the experiment, the conditions changed because one of the chains began delivering a mild high frequency shock, okay, to the monkey in the nearby compartment whenever the chain was pulled. And out of the 15 monkeys, 10 showed a statistically significant preference for the chain that did not deliver shocks to the other monkey. Now, interestingly, one monkey stopped pulling either of the chains for 5 days straight, while another refrained for up to 12 days. And the study found that monkeys that had themselves experienced shock showed a higher likelihood of self-starvation when given the choice between causing pain to another or going without food. And this experiment, what it highlights is the appearance, at least, of altruistic behaviors in rhesus monkeys and a preference to avoid harming their others. Their conspecifics, they would call them, right? Even at the cost of their own food intake. All right, let's talk about babies. In 2011, researchers Hamlin and Wynn, they conducted a puppet show an experiment to explore how infants evaluate social behavior. And in the show, a dog puppet tried but struggled to open a box, right? So this little dog's trying to open this box. After several attempts on the fifth try, a cat puppet comes to help. And together they open the box. Okay, great. The dog then grabs a little rattle inside, and then the cat helper leaves the stage. But then they're shown another version of the story where there is a closer puppet. A puppet comes along instead and slams the box shut and prevents the dog from getting the rattle. Now, when given a choice afterwards, 25 out of 34 children show preference for the helper versus the closer. And this suggests that even very young babies, pre-verbal, can recognize and prefer pro-social actions of helping, right, over hindering. And there are many other studies that have observed babies showing strong reactions to violation of fairness, like a mother ignoring a crying baby, right, which is unexpected behavior for maternal warmth. These early responses point to infants having an intuitive sense of social evaluation, which distinguishes between nice and not so nice behaviors in others from a very, very young age. So 9-month-olds, 5-month-old. There's even another study out there looking at 3-month-old and finding that they have an increased interest in social presentations that involve unhelpful behaviors, presumably because their expectations are being violated, right? In this picture, this is actually, you recognize me, hopefully it's me and my son who's blissfully unaware as he's subjected to an experiment as I search for a glimmer of a moral compass after he's hit me in the face a few times. Uh, Luckily for me, it turns out he's not a psychopath. So all right, so we're coming to a wrap up here. Um, just two or three more slides, so bear with me. So let's look at the other question now, right? Is intuition actually beneficial for us, right? Firstly, how do we define it? We need to define it. So I define it as a hidden, rapid, automatic, and nonlinear process that integrates somatic, so body, emotional, and cognitive information to produce a signal that facilitates decision making. So one of the famous studies related to intuition comes from Antonio Damasio, which led him to something called the somatic marker hypothesis. And in this study, he engages people in something he called the Iowa gambling task that he invented. And as with gambling, there's uncertainty, right? And what he found was that decisions were being made based on physical reactions being registered in an area of the brain called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. That's this area. We've also ran into that before. Um, this area, however, you don't see it there, but it is a convergence zone of many other areas of the brain, right? There are highways of information flow coming from the amygdala, the anterior cingulate cortex, the hippocampus, and insula and orbital frontal cortex, many areas. And in fact, when this area is damaged, it does lead to deficits and impairments in decision making because it facilitates the process of incorporating emotional signals and future consequences, leading to increased impulsivity, irrational decisions, and difficulties with moral judgments with people who have damage to this area, as a reminder. There are other theories of intuition, right? Kahneman's dual process theory that divides our brain into two systems, right? One that is conscious, deliberate, effortful, system two, and another that's rapid, effortless, and intuitive, system one, based on heuristics and pattern recognition. Then Clark had his theory, right, of predictive processing, positing that intuition relates to predictions on prior knowledge and expectations. The important point here that I'm making is that all of these are connected by the definition I provided, that intuition is not blind, right, and can be very advantageous in certain contexts. Again, right, we have this mismatch between, right, the conditions we evolved for and the current society that we're living in. So we can't expect intuition to solve all of our issues, but it is very intelligent for specific things, okay? So the ultimate conclusion, I'm just going to give you the ultimate conclusion because we don't have time, is that it is most helpful in situations that are complex and with too many uncertain variables. Whereas when there is something simple or complex, but with very clear variables, analysis does seem to outperform intuition. Okay. So this is just something I put together that there are a variety of different ways our intuition can show itself. I came up with the acronym MAST, another acronym I know, MAST, helps us remember things though, right? Muse, right? Signals can be creativity oriented, provides inspirational ideas like in Mozart and Escher. The advisor signals can come as advice, a feeling, or the bodily experience, suggesting one decision over another. The sage signals of related to morality or the sacred, feelings of being moved or to tears by admiration by a person's character traits. It points to values and the ways of being that are necessary to help you develop. And the teacher, signals that come as a lesson, like an aha moment that comes to a scientist at a time unrelated to work. So it's like next time you have an intuitive experience, can you identify them? Do you have more muses or advisors or sages or teachers? I wonder if that can be helpful in some way. And finally, I'm going to wrap this up with this final slide. It's to introduce you to how I'm sort of incorporating this work into psychological framework for practice and how it might be used. And the following one is a practical tool that can possibly be used. And you can see there in the center column, we have all the 7 principles. On the left side, a column indicating what it might mean to have a deficiency, like we talked about these stagnation and hyperopia. And on the right side, what it means to have an excess. And so after someone, let's say in session, learns what these are, they would then be asked to rank themselves on this scale by perhaps placing a dot where they think it might be. This would be a case where they would use their intuition, right? After knowing what these things are. Like I feel like, or my experience is, or what feels most congruent to me, right, would be, perhaps being right here. That I don't fully have a creative being because I continue to stagnate or hold myself back because I cling to relationships or whatever the case is, right? And so this sort of provides a visual for where someone might be, how aligned or misaligned they might be. If they're anywhere but the center, they're going to be misaligned in some way. And then the question becomes, well, what can you do to bring yourself closer to the center? And so you can see how this might be used as a way to track progress through time. And the book offers several questions one can ask themselves as they rank themselves on the spectrum and also a case conceptualization. So I use the creative liberty, I call it the neurodaonamic approach. I hope no one in this group takes offense to that. Uh, but with that, I'd like to again thank you all for your attention, and perhaps we can now open it up to questions and or Q&A.
Yes, please. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Aldrich. I have been talking with students for years about, we'll bring up these concepts in the Taoist classical text and say, wow, this sounds like it would be really useful to use in some sort of modern psychological context. And now
Mm.
here you've gone and done it. So I can now assign this book now that it's out. Again, reminder everyone, the book is out now. So if you're interested, you can pick up a copy.